James Whitfield had no particular interest in tractors before the summer of 2023. He was 38 years old. He worked as a high school history teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. He owned a house in a suburb with a small yard and a two-car garage. He had never farmed. He had visited his grandfather's farm in Harlan County as a child, summers mostly, and he had memories of the place the way adults remember childhood summers, in fragments of light and smell and feeling rather than specific events. He remembered the hills, he remembered the creek, he remembered his grandfather, a quiet man named Earl Whitfield, moving through the farm with the deliberate economy of someone who had been doing the same work for 50 years and knew exactly where everything was and how everything worked. And he remembered the tractor. Red, old, parked usually near the smaller of the two barns, sometimes running, sometimes not. He had ridden on it once as a boy, sitting on Earl's lap while Earl pulled a disc harrow through a pasture field. That was the extent of James's connection to the Massey Ferguson 35, until Earl died in April 2023 and left him the farm. The will had surprised everyone. Earl had two adult children, James's father Robert and an aunt named Clara. Both of them had left Harlan County decades ago and had no interest in returning. The farm was 400 acres of hill country, some bottom pasture, some timber, a farmhouse that needed work, and a collection of old equipment that hadn't been used seriously since Earl's health had declined 5 years earlier. The farm's assessed value was about $380,000. Not nothing, but not a windfall. Robert and Clara had expected Earl to divide everything between them. Instead, Earl had left the farm and everything on it to James, with a handwritten note attached to the will that said only, "James knows how to look at things." Robert and Clara were surprised but not bitter. They had no desire to manage a hill farm in Harlan County. They signed the estate documents and moved on. James drove down to the farm in June to see what he had inherited and figure out what to do with it. The farmhouse needed a new roof and a lot of cosmetic work, but the bones were solid. The larger barn was structurally sound. The smaller barn, the one where the tractor had always been parked, had a soft section in the floor, but was otherwise standing. James walked through everything slowly. He opened doors he had never opened as a child. He looked in the shed and found an old cultivator and a disc harrow and various hand tools. He looked in the smaller barn and found the Massey Ferguson 35. It was in worse shape than he remembered. The red paint was mostly gone, replaced by orange-brown rust spreading across the hood and the engine block. The rear tires were flat and cracked. The seat had rotted away to the spring frame. The steering wheel was bare metal, the rubber grip long since deteriorated. The front tires held air, but were badly weathered. The whole machine sat in a shaft of light coming through a gap in the barn roof, and in that light it looked like something from an excavation site, like something that had been buried and was only now being uncovered. James sat on an old wooden box in the barn and looked at the tractor for a long time. He thought about selling the farm. The practical answer was to list it with a real estate agent, take the $380,000 and put it in an index fund. He was a history teacher. He didn't know anything about farming. He didn't live in Harlan County. The farm would be a constant management problem from 200 miles away. He knew all of this. And yet he sat in the barn and looked at the Massey Ferguson and thought about his grandfather's note. James knows how to look at things. He thought about what that meant. Earl had been a precise man who chose his words carefully. He had not written James is a farmer, or James will love this place. He had written, James knows how to look at things. James was a history teacher. His professional life was built on looking at objects and documents and places and understanding what they contained. Earl had known that, and Earl had left him a farm with a tractor and a barn and a cryptic note. James decided not to sell. Not yet. He would spend the summer on the farm and figure it out. He started with the tractor because it was the most manageable project. He bought sandpaper and wire brushes and a random orbital sander from a hardware store in Harlan. He read online guides to tractor restoration. He watched videos on rust removal and surface preparation. His plan was modest. He was not going to do a full mechanical restoration. He didn't have the skills or the tools. but he wanted to strip the rust and old paint, assess what he had, and either repaint it himself or find a local restoration shop to take over. It was something to do with his hands, while he thought about the larger question of what to do with 400 acres of Kentucky hill country. He started on the hood on the first Saturday of July. He set up a work lamp in the barn and began sanding. The old red paint came off in flakes and powder. Beneath it was gray primer, old and chalky. Beneath the primer was bare metal. He worked methodically, section by section, the way he approached research, with patience and attention to sequence. The sanding was meditative. The barn was quiet except for the sound of the tool. By noon, he had cleared the top surface of the hood down to bare metal. He turned off the sander and looked at the result. And then he stopped. He turned the work lamp directly onto the cleared section and looked more carefully. The metal was not gray. It was not the silver gray of bare steel or the blue gray of cast iron. The surface had a warm amber quality, a slight golden undertone that he initially attributed to the angle of the light. He moved the lamp. The color remained. He moved the lamp again, still the same warm amber. He rubbed the surface with a clean rag. The color did not change. He scratched a small area gently with a nail. The scratch showed the same color throughout. It was not a coating. It was the metal itself. James set down the sander and sat on the wooden box and looked at the hood. He was a history teacher, not a metallurgist. He did not know how to read metal by color. He knew that different alloys had different appearances, that bronze was distinguishable from steel and iron in certain contexts, that precious metal plating looked different from solid metal. But he was not equipped to diagnose what he was looking at on the basis of visual inspection alone. He took photographs with his phone. Many photographs, from different angles and in different light. He sent them to two people. One was a colleague at his school who taught chemistry. The other was a man named Davis Holt, who James had met at a conference 3 years earlier and who worked as an industrial metallurgist for a manufacturing firm in Cincinnati. Davis was the kind of person who found unusual material questions interesting. James sent him the photos with a message explaining what he had found and asking if he had any initial thoughts. Davis replied within an hour. He said the color was consistent with bronze alloy or possibly a high copper iron blend. He said it was unusual for agricultural equipment. He said he would need a physical sample to say anything definitive. James said he would bring a sample if Davis could analyze it. Davis said he could have a result in a week. James spent the following week continuing to strip the tractor. He worked carefully, documenting each section as he cleared it. The color was consistent across every surface he exposed. Hood, engine block, transmission housing, frame rails, axle housings. Everywhere the old paint came off, the same warm amber metal was beneath it. There was no transition to standard gray steel. The entire machine, or at least every major casting he could access, appeared to be the same unusual material. By the end of the week, James had stripped most of the major surfaces and taken 27 photographs documenting the color distribution. He cut a small sample from a non-structural section of the hood using a hacksaw blade. The cut showed the same color all the way through the metal, not a plating over a different substrate, the same material throughout. He packaged the sample and drove it to Cincinnati on a Saturday morning. Davis ran the analysis that week. He called James on Thursday evening. He said he had run 3 separate analytical tests: XRF spectroscopy, optical emission spectrometry, and a hardness test. He said the results were unambiguous. The sample was a bronze alloy, specifically a high tin bronze with trace additions of phosphorus and manganese. The composition was approximately 88% copper, 10% tin, and 2% other elements. It was not a standard commercial bronze formulation. It was closer to a specialized industrial or military specification alloy from the mid-20th century. Davis said it was an extremely unusual material to find in an agricultural tractor. Standard Massey Ferguson 35 components were cast iron and steel. There was no commercial reason to use bronze for these components. Bronze was more expensive, harder to cast in large sections, and offered no performance advantage over iron in agricultural applications. Whatever reason this tractor had been built with bronze components, it was not a standard manufacturing decision. James thanked Davis and sat in his house and thought about what his grandfather had been keeping in that barn. James was a history teacher. He approached the question the way he approached any historical research problem. He started with what he knew and worked outward. He knew his grandfather, Earl Whitfield, had been born in Harlan County in 1932. He knew Earl had farmed the family land his entire life. He knew Earl had been educated, had graduated from the University of Kentucky in 1954 with a degree in metallurgical engineering. James had known this in the vague way that family members know facts about each other without paying close attention. He had never thought much about it. Earl had come back to the farm after graduation and farmed. He had not worked as an engineer. At least, James had assumed he had not worked as an engineer. He pulled out the boxes of Earl's papers that he had collected from the farmhouse and brought to the kitchen table. There were 3 boxes. He had not opened them since carrying them out of the house in June. He opened them now. The first box was farm records, crop yields, equipment purchase receipts, seed invoices going back to the 1960s. The second box was personal correspondence, letters from family members, church records, a few photographs. The third box was different. It contained technical documents, bound reports with government contractor headers, correspondence on letterhead James did not recognize. A series of notebooks filled with Earl's precise engineering handwriting covering material specifications, test parameters, field performance data. James pulled the notebooks out and spread them on the table. He started reading. He read for 4 hours. By midnight, he understood what his grandfather had done. Earl Whitfield had not simply returned to the farm after graduating in 1954. He had taken a position as a consulting engineer with a defense contractor based in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, called Consolidated Alloy Research Associates. Kara had been contracted by the Department of Defense in the early 1950s to develop high-performance alloy components for military equipment. The specific program Earl had worked on involved developing bronze alloys with superior wear resistance and corrosion tolerance for use in engine components and drivetrain parts in humid and tropical environments. The Korean War had exposed significant corrosion problems in American military equipment operating in wet conditions. Bronze alloys had been identified as a potential solution. Kara had spent 4 years developing and testing specific bronze formulations. Earl's notebooks documented his work on the alloy composition that Davis had identified: high-tin bronze with phosphorus and manganese additions. Alloy designation HT7. Earl had been the lead engineer on HT7 development. The notebooks showed 3 years of composition refinement, casting trials, and mechanical testing. By 1957, HT7 had met the DoD's performance specifications for tropical military applications. The final notebook contained the field trial documentation. Kara had needed to test HT7 in real agricultural conditions because the DoD specification required performance data under sustained mechanical stress over multiple years. Military equipment worked under conditions similar in some ways to heavy agricultural use: continuous operation, variable loads, outdoor exposure. Kara had arranged for the fabrication of a complete set of major components for a 1957 Massey Ferguson 35, using HT7 alloy instead of standard cast iron. The Massey Ferguson 35 had been chosen because it was the most common utility tractor in the region, and its operational patterns were well documented. Earl had taken the HT7-equipped MF-35 to his family farm in Harlan County and put it to work. He had used it for planting, cultivation, haying, and general farm work for 12 consecutive years between 1958 and 1970. He had documented everything: engine hours, load conditions, weather exposure, component wear measurements taken every 6 months. The data filled 2 notebooks. The HT7 components had performed exceptionally, wear rates significantly below the standard iron components in the control tractor Earl had run alongside. Corrosion resistance substantially superior, fatigue life at the grain boundaries measurably better under sustained load cycling. Earl had sent the annual reports to Kara. Kara had sent them to the DoD program office, and then in 1969 the program had been canceled, not because HT7 had failed, because the Vietnam War had changed the DoD's procurement priorities and the budget for the materials research program had been eliminated. CARA had dissolved in 1971. The program records had been archived at a federal facility in Maryland. Earl had kept the tractor. The final entry in the last notebook, dated December 1970, read, "Program concluded. Tractor to remain in service on farm property. All documentation retained per contractor requirements. Component integrity confirmed through 1970 inspection. Recommend continued service life of minimum 30 additional years with standard maintenance." Signed, E.W. Whitfield, Chief Materials Engineer. Earl had continued farming with the HT7 Massey Ferguson for another 30 years after the program ended. He had maintained it. He had painted it red to match standard Massey Ferguson appearance. He had never told anyone what was underneath the paint. His wife had died in 1995. His children had left. He had farmed alone with the tractor until his health declined in 2018. And then he had parked it in the barn and waited. James thought about the note in the will. James knows how to look at things. Earl had known James would strip the tractor down. He had known a history teacher would want to restore something, would want to understand something. He had left the tractor to the one person in the family who would look at unusual amber-colored metal and ask what it was instead of painting over it. James called Davis back and told him everything. Davis was quiet for a long time. Then he said the bronze in the tractor represented a significant quantity of material. He asked James if he had estimated the total weight of the bronze components. James said he had not. Davis said a standard Massey Ferguson 35 had approximately 800 to 900 kilograms of iron in its major castings. If Earl's tractor had equivalent bronze components, at current copper prices around $9 per kilogram for bronze alloy scrap, the raw material value would be in the range of $7,000 to $8,000 as scrap. But Davis said the tractor was not scrap. The tractor was a documented prototype of a government-sponsored materials research program from the 1950s. Its historical and scientific value was substantially greater than its material value. A working example of a mid-century military alloy development program with complete documentation in operational condition was potentially worth considerably more than the copper content. Davis said James should talk to a museum curator and a materials historian before he talked to a scrap dealer or even a collector. James spent August making calls. He contacted the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. He contacted the American Society for Metals. He contacted a professor at the University of Kentucky who specialized in mid-century American industrial history. He contacted the National Archives in Maryland and requested the CARA program files, which were unclassified and available under FOIA after more than 50 years. The FOIA request took 6 weeks. When the documents arrived, they confirmed everything Earl's notebooks had documented and added details James hadn't known. The program had been considered successful. The program manager's final report had recommended continued development of HT7 for specific military applications. The cancellation had been budgetary, not technical. The report noted that the field trial tractor, designated FT1, had been retained by the contractor's field representative for continued long-term observation. The field representative was identified as E.W. Whitfield of Harlan County, Kentucky. The University of Kentucky historian, a woman named Dr. Sandra Park, drove to Harlan County in September to examine the tractor and the documentation. She spent 2 days photographing everything and reading Earl's notebooks. She said it was one of the most complete examples of a Cold War-era materials research program she had ever encountered in the field. She said the combination of the physical prototype and the complete field trial documentation was exceptional. She said most programs like this existed only in archived reports. Having the actual test article in working condition was remarkable. She said the tractor belonged in a museum. James asked which museum. She said she could make introductions to several institutions that would be interested. She said the Smithsonian would be the most prominent option. But the American Precision Museum in Vermont had expressed interest in exactly this type of Cold War industrial history, and the Oak Ridge National Laboratory Museum had obvious relevance given the Tennessee connection. She said any of these institutions would likely pay a significant acquisition price for the tractor and the documentation as a complete collection. James thought about it for 2 months. He thought about it while he repaired the barn roof. He thought about it while he walked the farm in the evenings. He thought about his grandfather farming for 30 years, with a government prototype parked in the barn, never telling anyone, continuing to document the performance data in his notebooks, maintaining the machine with the same care he would have given to any farm equipment. Earl had not been mysterious about it out of secrecy in a dramatic sense. He had been maintaining professional standards. The documentation was contractor property until the program was formally closed. By the time Earl might have talked about it freely, it had simply become part of his life. The tractor was how he farmed. The notebooks were how he worked. The paint was practical. He was not hiding treasure. He was doing his job, and then he was farming. And the two things had become the same thing over 60 years. In November 2023, James donated the Massey Ferguson 35 and the complete documentation to the Smithsonian Institution. The Smithsonian's Acquisition Committee valued the collection at $280,000 for insurance and accounting purposes. They paid James a negotiated acquisition price of $190,000, acknowledging that market comparables for this type of object were nearly non-existent. James used the money to repair the farmhouse roof, update the plumbing and electrical, and establish an operating fund for the farm. He did not sell the land. He hired a local farmer to manage the 400 acres on a sharecrop arrangement. He drove down from Lexington 4 or 5 times a year to walk the property. He stood sometimes in the smaller barn where the tractor had been parked and looked at the empty space where it had sat. The floor still showed the faint outline of the tire marks. The work lamp he had brought in that first Saturday in July was still plugged into the wall. James would stand in the barn and think about his grandfather farming for 60 years with a government prototype, painting it red, keeping it running, keeping the notebooks in a box, waiting for someone who knew how to look at things. The Massey Ferguson 35 is in the Smithsonian now, in a gallery dedicated to Cold War-era materials science and industrial research. The bronze castings are visible where the restoration team removed the old paint under James's supervision before the transfer. The amber metal gleams under the museum lights the way it had gleamed under James's work lamp on a July morning in a barn in Harlan County. The placard beside it reads, Massey Ferguson 35 Modified, 1957. HT7 Bronze Alloy Field Trial Prototype. Donated by James Whitfield, grandson of Earl Whitfield, Chief Materials Engineer, Consolidated Alloy Research Associates, Oak Ridge, Tennessee, 1954 to 1969. The tractor that farmed for 60 years while carrying a secret worth more than the land it worked. Earl's last notebook is displayed in a case beside the tractor, open to the final entry. December 1970. Program concluded. Tractor to remain in service on farm property. Signed, E.W. Whitfield. James had read that entry 100 times. He thought about it every time he drove past the hardware store in Harlan, where he had bought the sandpaper that started everything. He thought about what his grandfather had known and what he had kept and what he had finally decided to pass on. Not the money, not the fame, not the recognition that would have come from revealing what he had built. Just a tractor in a barn and a note in a will, and the quiet faith that the right person would sand down to the metal and ask the right question.